Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Steve Price in for Peter Credlin. Should be back with you on Monday. And a reminder, of course, tomorrow is the Remembrance Day, 11th of November, hence the poppy. Make sure you can go out and buy one and see if you can at 11 o'clock tomorrow. Pause and remember all of those great Australians who've given their lives in whatever battle they fought in right around the world. Here's what's coming up on Credlin tonight. Now, in the week that interest rates went up, we just talked real estate there with Erin, a 13th time. Major capital cities around Australia are experiencing a rental crisis. Now, in Melbourne, the vacancy rate barely touches 1%. The real estate industry is predicting a rental catastrophe. We'll try and find out where to next for rental prices around the country. And we have an update on something I mentioned last week, the looming battle between Australians who grow food for us, our farmers, and the global warming zealots that want to carpet bomb regional Australia with wind turbines and solar panels. We'll catch up with the new boss of the Farmers Federation and see what they're doing to try and prevent that. I'm going to have my say on the threat by Victoria Police to take industrial action, can you believe this, over a stalled EBA and work conditions at a time when politicians have put their hands out for higher pay and governments waste money on all sorts of pet projects. That's disgraceful. I have more to say on that in a moment. And this is breaking news. We're going to have Victorian Deputy Opposition Leader David Southwick who'll join us later in the hour. There's tensions threatening to boil over tonight in the Melbourne suburb of Caulfield. Very high Jewish population there, with threats of a pro-Palestinian protest and claims by the Islamic Council that a local burger joint, a shop fire, was in fact a hate crime. First, though, the wages and conditions dispute that threatens to erupt into industrial action from a group of public servants who, in my view, deserve our 100% support. And I speak, of course, of the Victoria Police Force. Now, in a week that saw the tragic loss of 5 people when a car ploughed through the beer garden of a country pub, the Victorian Police, the very people who would have been the first people on that scene, and indeed local coppers in Daylesford reportedly ran several hundred metres down the road after hearing what sounded like an explosion to get there. Well, police in that state, in Victoria, are now on the edge of an industrial campaign because Police Command and the Victorian government cannot settle a new working agreement. I mean, this is incredible. The police union, who are after a 4% rise and paid overtime, have not even had an offer put to them. The current EBA, as I said, the working agreement, it runs out in 2 weeks today. 2 weeks. I mean, seriously? Given what the politicians are paying themselves, is there even an argument to be had here? This year alone, and you might find these numbers confronting, back in July, the political hacks, the politicians, the backbenchers, they were all handed a 3.5% pay rise. And they say, oh, well, it's nothing to do with us, it's an independent review. Well, the police want 4% and haven't had even an offer. Nothing on paper, nothing, zero. You know what the base salary of a Victorian backbencher is? Hold your breath. A Victorian backbencher earns $199,000 a year plus perks. Let's call it $200,000 for simplicity. For doing what exactly? Sitting sometimes anonymously for years on the Parliament's backbench, driving around in a taxpayer-funded car, running on taxpayer-funded petrol with an office and staff. And that's just the no-name politicians. The just-departed Victorian Premier, known colloquially as Chairman Dan, Daniel Andrews, was being paid $481,190 after getting a $16,000 pay rise in July. I mean, that adds up, if you add it up, to 7 times the salary of a constable coming out of the police academy on $70,000 before tax. Now, how do these people, these politicians, how do they look our police officers in the eye? But this gets even worse for the Victorian public, and I'm sure the situation in other states is not much better. With law and order a major problem in Melbourne, think about home invasions, carjackings, police chases and drug and knife crime, police are leaving the police force in huge numbers. The Herald Sun today reports an average of 500 police a year over the last 4 years are quitting, walking away, often to better paid careers in the private sector. A staggering, and I can't believe this number, 800 police are off duty on work cover. many driven to sideline themselves during the stressful COVID years of 2020 and 2021. A survey by RMIT today found that 55% of those police that were surveyed were likely to look for a new job. Now, these are the people, never forget, who you call when you need help. These are the people who are the first to witness twisted, broken bodies in road smashes and all the blood and gore that goes with it. These are the ones who chase drug-crazed lunatics in stolen cars around the suburbs. They face down people armed with machetes and knives, and they have to resist themselves pulling their weapon. Police are poorly paid, and the union claims they do hours and hours and hours of unpaid overtime. Now, this, remember, when we're talking about politicians, they're the same ones who forced the Victoria Police during COVID to prosecute laws that were over the top and ridiculous. Think about shutting down playgrounds and firing rubber bullets at anti-vaxxers. Look, I know Victoria, because of political incompetence, is broke. The budget deficit's bigger than Queensland and New South Wales combined, and every major project is over time and over budget. But do we really want police forced to paint slogans on the side of police cars as they're threatening and flashlights to warn of speed cameras as part of an industrial campaign? Of course we don't. Now, I'll talk to the state opposition later about that, but let's support our police and support them and pay them properly. And if you see a police officer out on the streets this weekend, congratulate them for the work that they actually do on our behalf. Let's head to Canberra now for tonight's political headlines with Sky News political reporter Trudy McIntosh.
Good evening. Australia will offer refuge to hundreds of residents from the Pacific nation of Tuvalu. The Commonwealth country, with a population of just 11,000 people, is suffering the catastrophic effects of climate change. Sea level rises threaten to swamp homes and businesses. Each year, 280 Tuvalu residents will be eligible to live and work in Australia.
What is without doubt the most significant agreement between Australia and a Pacific island nation ever.
The Prime Minister also agreed to provide military and humanitarian assistance to the nation going forward.
This partnership stands as a beacon of hope, signifying not just a milestone, but a giant leap forward.
The deal was brokered on the sidelines of the Pacific Islands Forum. No stuffy meeting room in sight in the Cook Islands. Leaders held talks instead aboard a traditional Polynesian vessel while they floated around the lagoon. The government has begun to immediately release dozens of people from indefinite immigration detention, including a convicted rapist. The High Court ruling found it was unlawful to hold refugees or asylum seekers in detention if there's no real prospect of them being resettled in another country. It overturns 20 years of legal precedent used by both sides of politics.
What the government will do, everything within its power, is to ensure that this release happens under the strictest possible conditions.
There's nothing we can do about the High Court's decision, but the government should have had a plan B to protect the community from what are serious offenders.
And Optus's plan to compensate customers with free data in the wake of the network outage has been labelled as a joke. The telco is in damage control after the massive blackout. Optus offering customers 200 gigabytes of data rather than compensation.
I laughed a lot because 200 gigabytes of data has zero value in today's economy.
They should slash bills, or at least they reimburse customers for what they lost for that. People lost a lot of money for all their businesses and things like that, so I think they should do more.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
Good on you, Trudy. Thank you for that. Let's get stuck in. That massive Optus blackout, by the way, was just a disgrace. We'll talk to our panel about that. The Prime Minister, as we know, is in the Cook Islands for the Pacific Forum. He seems to be handing out money and visas now as well. And Israel's ground invasion of Gaza continues. You've got more casualties on both sides, and I'll keep an eye on that protest that might unfold tonight in Caulfield. Joining me to get the latest on all of the news around the country, One Nation Chief of Staff James Ashby and former Speaker of the House Bronwyn Bishop. Bronwyn and James, welcome. Can we start with this High Court ruling? And Bronwyn, this is against locking people up in immigration detention indefinitely. It's been labelled by the High Court disturbing because it could lead to lots of stateless detainees being released. The ruling overturns the precedent. You were in government when this was introduced. I can't look. The High Court can say what it likes, but you'd have to say that program that the former government put in place to house refugees offshore worked because it stopped the boats.
Well, it did. And Steve, if I might say, I think what people don't understand about the High Court is that it is able to overrule itself. Unlike any other court which is bound by rulings already made, it can overrule itself, and it does, which is why it's so unpredictable. And what this means is that not only does it make it more difficult to protect our borders, but also our people. Because the message will go around to the people smugglers. They monitor what happens in this country. And of course, with these people being released, a pedophile who raped a 10-year-old boy being released into the community. And the strange thing about it is the speed with which that decision was given, and we're yet to see what the split was in the court and what the reasoning of the court was. So there are many things to be answered, but one thing's for sure: the government is going to have to react, and quickly, with a way to restore faith in our policies and to protect our people.
James, I guess we shouldn't be surprised that the Albanese government is probably going to celebrate the fact that this has happened. I mean, Labor has never liked offshore detention ever, have they?
No, they sure haven't. And if you remember rightly, back in 2018, Labor teamed up with Karen Phelps, the independent from New South Wales, and helped overturn or change the immigration and detention legislation back in those days so that these people could be brought to Australia. These were the very worst of the worst. These are people that tried to come to this country under a refugee program. They were told at the time, don't come here, you'll never come to Australia. We rehoused so many of those people in other countries, but these are the worst of the worst. These are the people that those other countries didn't want to take, and yet, knowing full well Karen Phelps and the Labor Party helped overturn legislation to bring them here to Australia on medical terms, and that's a very loose term, medical terms. Look, Labor's got a big job ahead of them. They should on Monday have legislation ready to go. I don't care whether they've got to sit all week next week, both in the lower house and the Senate, to get something passed that will close this loophole, overturn the decision of the High Court and protect Australians. But that's what needs to happen next week.
Well, while we're talking about our borders and protecting our border security, I mean, the Prime Minister, as we know, is in the Cook Islands. We saw pictures of him floating around on a boat in the opener there. But he's announced that Australia's going to offer climate asylum to all residents of the Pacific island of Tuvalu. He's also announced his government will not be rushed into announcing its emissions targets for 2035. So this worries me. Bronwyn, does this not set an incredible situation up here for Australia? It's a precedent that we're going to have to deal with. If you say to Tuvalu, oh, look, we think your island's going to sink so you can all come and become Australians, what happens to the rest of the Pacific Islands? What happens to other countries who say, well, hang on, what about us?
Well, it will be a precedent, and it has been set. But there is merit in having Pacific Island peoples on a visa able to come more easily to Australia. We need their people to come here and to work, particularly in agricultural areas, in aged care. They're very welcome in this country. But once again, here's the Prime Minister handing away yet more millions of dollars, not discussed, making this announcement on this new form of visa without it ever having been discussed. He seems just to be out of control. He's certainly out of the country far too much. And if the Parliament needs to be recalled, if he dares to put his foot back in the country for long enough, he can be present. But if he's not here present, then the Parliament should sit and deal with the question of that we've just been discussing, of how to deal with these worst of the worst, as you described them. It's just no way to run a country. It is just. I've said again and again that for 20 years I sat in the Parliament, in the House of Reps with that man, and nobody ever said he was leadership material, and he's just proving it. He's simply elbow the trot.
James, this issue of Tuvalu, I mean, let's start with, is it actually sinking and is it going to disappear? And how does the government intend to choose who of the Tuvalu people actually get to come here? I think they've talked about something like 1,800 out of a population of 11,000, I think the figures are. How are they going to work that out?
Well, it's another promise that's been made on, well, it's probably worked out on the back of a coaster on his way over there, to be quite honest with you, Steve. Look, you're right to say that it's about 2.5% of the population every year will be given that gold ticket to Australia if they want. But you're right also to question whether or not Tuvalu's actually sinking. A study by the University in Auckland actually revealed over the last 4 decades, the island size, the island's mass has actually increased by 180 acres. So this is just, you know, these Pacific Island nations have been playing Australia. They know that we've been giving them more and more money because they play on this whole fact that, oh, climate change. Well, now we're just playing into it again. Albanese needs to get serious. Here in Queensland, we've got a vacancy rate in housing under 1% across our state. I don't know where these people are going to go, especially if we're going to continue with our refugee program from right across the rest of the world as well. Nuts. This is crazy.
Bronwyn, a 10% jump in 12 months in the number of public servants in Canberra. Again, to the cost of living crisis and the fact that we've got such pressure on the budget, why are we employing so many more public servants? What the hell are they doing?
Well, clearly a lot of it is going to have a looking after your mates component. But let's be honest. The government spending is out of control. They are spending money, let alone the off-budget money, but on-budget money they're spending. And at the same time, they're trying to kid people and say they care about the cost of living and reducing it. Now, the fact of the matter is they could use money that is, instead of employing additional public servants, they could use that money to reduce the cost of the fuel excise, because fuel is one of those things that's in the basket that is measured, that counts towards inflation. And as Paul Murray's been saying night after night, why don't they reduce the fuel excise like previous governments did, like Morrison did and like John Howard did? It's a very real thing that can be done for people. But the fact is that the government just spends money again and again without it being properly evaluated. And then comes out and says to the Reserve Bank, oh, don't put the rates up, which of course in the mind of the new governor says, well, I better put them up, otherwise I'm under the thumb of the government. There is absolutely out of kilter monetary and fiscal policy. And this government has no idea about what it's doing to try and relieve the pressures on people.
James, what gets me about a 10% increase in public servants is the government continues to spend money, and I know One Nation has spoken about this, on consultants. I mean, all of those consultants that get employed to do government reports into policies that the government might want to introduce. So the public servants that we're all paying and increasing the number of them, they're not actually doing anything.
And the other big problem, Steve, is none of them are held accountable. So many of these bureaucrats that are employed in Canberra are giving false advice, and when it's been found out to be false advice, like, for example, the Snowy Hydro scheme, when we were told that it was going to cost $2 billion to implement that, and now it's blown out to new figures, which they're predicting to be around $20 billion, nobody is accountable. So not only have we got the expense of the bureaucrats, but we've got the expense of their mistakes going on top of it. So it's a basket case. I don't know why we're using them. Get rid of half of them. They're useless.
James, thanks for your time. Good to see you. Now, before we go, Bronwyn, I think you've got something to say.
Yes, indeed. When I was discussing the terrible situation in the Middle East on Sky News last night and the awful anti-Semitism that we're witnessing, I made some comments about the ABC. If I offended anyone, I'm sorry. I will remain committed to calling out atrocities, and my support for the people of Israel is unwavering.
Welcome back. Steve Prios in for Peter Credlin. And I know Peter's done a lot of work on this issue of transmission lines across perfectly good farming country, so I'll catch up with the National Farmers Federation shortly and talk about the idea that we're going to have solar panels and wind turbines right across the country. But I want to look at the rental market in Australia. Now, it's so dire that in just one city alone, over 1,000 homes were taken off the rental market in 1 month as rates plummeted to a new record low. I mean, you can understand it. Investors are getting out of property because of the taxes that are lobbed on top of owning a rental property, particularly in the case of Victoria. For more to get an expert view on this, we're joined by the CEO of Victoria's Real Estate Institute, Quentin Killian. Great to catch up with you, Quentin. Melbourne rental conditions are said to be the least, the worst in the country. Why is Melbourne so bad?
Look, Steve, the bottom line is that the rental vacancy rate is caused by supply or lack thereof. And quite honestly, our policymakers seem to have gone astray. They have disappeared. And unless we start incentivising very, very quickly, the mum and dad investors who, for all intents and purposes, make up about 70% of the rent providers in this state, then we are heading towards a rent catastrophe. We have a rental vacancy rate that is barely touching on 1%. A comfortable range should be sitting somewhere around 2.5% to 3%.
Catastrophe is a very strong word, but I know you know the numbers, and that's why you've used that language. What does a rent catastrophe actually look like, Quentin?
Well, you mentioned that the PropTrack study that came out the other day said that there was over 1,000 properties left the market in just this last month. If you actually look back further than that and you look at the last 12 months, we've seen around about 25% of the investors leave the market. And we know that 1 in 4, and we've done a survey of our members, 1 in 4 of the investors in this market are either looking to leave or are on the verge of leaving. Now, if you take the numbers that are in the bond register and then multiply that back, that's equating to around about 150 to 160,000 properties that are going to or are coming out of the Victorian market. That's 150,000 properties that people can no longer live in. They no longer can rent them because they're just not there. They're not in the rental market, which is an astronomical number when you're thinking about people who need a roof over their head. That's what is scaring us at the moment.
I mentioned this last week, I think. I mean, when you walk around the inner suburbs of Melbourne, as I do, particularly in the inner east and inner southeast, I can't walk down a street or go around a block without seeing, in particular, Quentin, 1-bedroom apartments that are up for sale. And there's hundreds of them. And I can only presume they are investors fleeing the market because of the taxation changes, property taxation changes in particular, that were introduced by the former Andrews government, now the current Allen government.
Well, not just property taxes, but also regulation. I mean, what we've seen in the May budget alone was the fact that your land tax has gone up. There's been a levy added on top of that for COVID relief. And then the threshold has come down. So the threshold where you started to pay land tax kicked in at about $300,000. That has now come down to $50,000, which means that every small investor, every person who is trying to make a go for their future is now going to be captured by land tax as well as a COVID levy on top of that. We now then have a vacant property tax, which has been increased and expanded statewide. So essentially, if you have a vacant property and you're not living in it, you will get taxed for it. What we don't understand is why the government has to continue going just straight down the pathway of tax, punish, punish, punish. What we're saying is incentivise. If you go the other way, if you say to these investors, if you say to mum and dads who are trying to make a go of it, here is an incentive. If you keep the property rented for 5 years, we'll give you a portion of your land tax back in the form of a rebate. And then every 5 years after that, if you've kept it rented, we'll give you another portion of your land tax back. They'll still make their taxes, but at the same time, they're incentivising rather than saying, if you don't do it our way, we're going to punish you.
What's going to happen to the younger generation? I mean, we have constant discussion about how they're never going to be able to afford to buy real estate in markets like Melbourne and Sydney in particular because of the price. And so they may become lifetime renters. But if there's nowhere to rent, they're stuck between an absolute rock and a hard place. What are we going to do with these young folk?
Well, that's a very good point, Steve. We are in a position where we need a massive injection of supply. We need to increase supply dramatically. But the problem with supply is you can't simply pop down to Bunnings and buy a block of flats or buy a suburb. It just doesn't happen. But the government has to start working on it, and they have to also look at public housing supply, not just looking at what they're calling affordable housing or build to rent. They have to bring to market a sizable quantity of social housing and public housing so that they can take the pressure off that private rental market and look after the people that need to be looked after the most. Because at the moment, they're not supplying that housing, which is pushing that cohort into the private market and putting more pressure on the low stocks that we already have in that area of the marketplace.
Yeah, we need leadership, political leadership, both in Canberra and in Melbourne. Quentin, thank you very much for joining us and explaining that. Now, the Australian Farmers Federation have slammed the Albanese Labor government for putting emissions reduction before the strength of our agriculture industry. Now, I mentioned this filling in for Peter last Friday. The Agriculture Minister, Murray Watt, has declared the sector must reduce its emissions. OK, this is the green dragon coming to get us all. Joining me to get the latest on this and more is the Victorian grain and livestock producer and the new National Farmers Federation president, David Johinke. David, great to catch up with you. I made the point on the program last week that it seems like we're going to carpet bomb great farming land with solar panels and wind turbines. There's a 560 hectare solar farm planned apparently for the King Valley in northeastern Victoria. How concerned are you?
Well, we're concerned that farmers aren't being involved in the conversation around where these assets are to be placed, how they're meant to be plugged into the network, and even having the ability to have that broader community discussion around neighbours, how those facilities are going to affect the neighbouring farm themselves, who may not be the one hosting it, but will also be affected. So for us, we're asking that the program and the process of announcing these projects, the process of engaging farmers is escalated, that farmers become the first ones to be point of contact when these are proposed, especially around transmission lines. And that alternatives are also seek around that transmission line discussion so that farmland's not the only area that's affected. And then also we can have the discussion around where's the best placement for these lines if they do need to go in, that productive farmland isn't taken away from the farms, and that power line or those transmission lines can be put where they should be, and that's along roadsides and that's along the sides and the fence lines of paddocks.
I know you're going to run a campaign. We'll get to that in a moment. I just want to get it clear in my own head and for the audience. What's the legal right of a farmer who owns his farm to deny access to a power generator company who wants to put a transmission line, a wind turbine or a solar panel on their property?
Well, generally when we talk solar farms and wind farms, that is, they're invited on. In the end, farmers do have the ability to have a right of veto. They don't have the ability to stop a survey area. They don't have the ability for projects to be proposed, but what they do have the ability is to say no to the hosting of those assets. However, when it comes to transmission lines, that's a different situation. Like the mining industry, we see the power lines or transmission lines being an essential service, an essential asset that farmers don't have the right of denying access or the ability for those infrastructure to be built. They have got the ability to deny access for the surveying, but that can be done via air. Once again, our concern is that farmers have to have the ability to have input to this conversation. They've got to have the ability to have the discussion around what is the most productive land on their farm that they want to keep sacred. And then we've got to have more alternatives put on the table so that those transmission lines aren't going through the middle of a farm. They can be put to the edge of those great assets, that prime land that we see, but also have the discussion around how much private land versus public land should be included in these transmission lines. We always hear the conversation around farmland being taken and private land being used, but we don't hear the discussion around how the public land is also going to be utilised in putting this infrastructure in. You can't just farmland.
I think we might have just lost David's audio there. We'll try and get that back. But the issue for me has always been this whole issue of whether a farmer can say to the power company that you can't come on. I mean, you imagine what the people who live in the cities don't have to worry about this, because the turbines and the solar panels are not going to be anywhere near the inner suburbs of places like Sydney and Melbourne. I mean, there's an issue with a transmission system that's going to run from southern New South Wales all the way down through Victoria and all the way, as I understand it, to an area between Ballarat and Bendigo. So that means that the farms right through there, they know the route of it, they've seen the map, but there's nothing much they can actually do to try and say to these companies, no, you can't come onto my property, which I just find extraordinary. And the farmers have got to put up with as well. I mean, issues like methane. The federal government wants to reduce the amount of methane that is produced by our cattle and sheep. And then you've got the issue of live sheep exports. Now, that's also being shut down. So I just don't, you feel very much for farmers. They have to deal with everything from droughts and floods, as they have over the last 4 or 5 years. Plus, they've had to deal with the issue of COVID. And now they've got to deal with the issue of someone knocking on their door and saying, well, thank you very much. What we want to do here is stick up a wind turbine or a solar panel. Now, people who want this stuff say, oh, well, the farmers are going to be compensated. They're probably not compensated as well as they need to be. And when it comes to transmission lines, they can't actually say no to that transmission company at all. I appreciate very much David Johinke joining us. We are now going to take a break. I'm going to come back and talk to David Southwick. Now, tensions are heating up in the Melbourne suburb of Caulfield as we go to air tonight. Now, a hamburger shop, which is owned by a pro-Palestinian activist, was burned down overnight. Now, the police are still investigating that. They say it could be a suspicious fire. They don't know. But there's already today people who are in the streets around that burned out burger shop, including the Islamic Council of Australia, suggesting that this was a hate crime. Now, no one knows why that burger shop burned down. I'm going to catch up with someone who's right in the middle of this whole debate. The local Liberal member for Caulfield, David Southwick, will try and get the latest. It is very, very concerning. Welcome back. We're keeping our eye on a developing story this evening in the Melbourne suburb of Caulfield. Now, Caulfield, as most people would know, has a large Jewish population. We're told at 4 o'clock this morning, a branch of a popular burger chain, a store called Burgatory, whose owner was one of those people who led chants at a pro-Palestinian rally earlier in the week. Well, that burger shop has now burned to the ground. Now, police are investigating. We've got no idea what happened there. It could be any number of reasons. But this afternoon, the Islamic Council of Australia released a press release, and they called the burning down of that burger shop, quote, a suspected hate crime. Now, I don't know how they believe they have more evidence than the police. There are now protests brewing tonight in Caulfield, and a pro-Palestinian rally was due to start there sometime early this evening. Deputy Liberal leader David Southwick, who is, of course, the member for Caulfield, as I said, joins us. What's the latest in the area of Caulfield? What do you know about what's happened there today so far?
Yeah, well, good evening, Steve. Obviously, we had a fire overnight of a burger store, Burgatory, and that unfortunately has caused a lot of tension where a number of people are actually pointing the finger at potentially the Jewish community for this. Now, the police have come out with a statement today that said that it doesn't appear to be racially motivated. It is being investigated by Victoria Police, but already we had effectively a group come down, let's call it a vigilante group come down. There were arrests that were made this group that were, from what I understand, had confronted an Israeli falafel shop that happens to be next door. Steve, tensions are really, really high. I know that people are pretty fired up at the moment. and we just don't need this. We're calling for calm, and certainly the one thing at the moment is we don't need the international situation in the Middle East to play out here on our streets here in Caulfield. It's not what people need right now. People are already very scared, and the last thing we need is people rushing to conclusions about something before a police investigation has taken its proper course. And if there are people who are responsible, then the full account of the law needs to be taken to these individuals.
What do you make of the Islamic Council making what is an inflammatory remark suggesting it was a hate crime?
Yeah, I mean, we need leadership from peak organisations right now. There is no question that people are living on edge. What we see in the Middle East and what we've seen over the last few weeks is horrific. No one wants to see that, but we don't want the same kind of situation that's playing out in the Middle East being played out locally. We need leadership from peak bodies like the Islamic Council. We would expect that they would be calling for calm for many of their members, and we've got to work peacefully together. The great thing about Victoria is it celebrated people from different backgrounds. Multiculturalism was our strength. It appears now it's becoming one of the big issues in terms of being so divisive. You can't have people being targeted. We're going into the Sabbath tonight, to the Friday night. We're now being informed that potentially there'll be a Palestinian rally right in the heart of Caulfield outside this burgatory store. As people are walking to synagogue, they will be confronted on the streets with Palestinian activists, I suspect with flags, chanting, carrying on, and also fuelled. We don't need any of that at this moment. This is not the Victoria I know, and I would be calling for calm. I would be saying that when people break the law, no matter who it is, if it's somebody within our own community, I would expect them to feel the full force of the law. But at the moment, that's not the situation. It's a fire that's being investigated, and that needs to run its course. But seriously, Steve, at the moment, the last thing we need is protesters outside in the heart of Caulfield trying to bring the issues of the Middle East locally into a community that is already still feeling the brunt of a massacre that happened on October 7.
And I imagine you'd be calling, David Southwick, for some leadership from the Victorian Labor government. I mean, you've got Labor and Green-dominated councils like Marybeck Council who've gone to a council meeting and voted to fly the Palestinian flag for 6 months, as well as reviewing contracts that they say they might have with businesses that are Israeli-owned. I mean, the Labor government in Victoria has got to come out and say to these councils, look, you're just making this situation more inflammatory, you're making it worse, you need to get out of the situation here and leave it alone.
Yeah, I've written to the Minister of Multicultural Affairs the Minister for Local Government on exactly this. You know, our rates, quite frankly, shouldn't be going to these local councils that think that they're commentators on international affairs. I mean, how ridiculous that they should be the authorities and spend ratepayers' money on these kinds of local protests. Flying flags on local council buildings, boycotting Israeli and potentially Jewish businesses is not the job of a council. Councils should be responsible for their rates, rubbish and roads. This is well and truly outside of their laneway, and they should be focused on what they're doing. And I would seriously be suggesting that if councils like this want to get involved in spending ratepayers' money on things that are completely outside of their wheelhouse, they should be defunded. They shouldn't be having their funding, which is hard-earned ratepayers' money in a cost of living crisis, being spent running their own political agendas. The Greens have been well and truly responsible. Labor's been slow to act on this. It's time these guys get called out.
David, have you yourself witnessed or heard of an increase in anti-Semitism? I mean, here on Sky, we reported on this over the last couple of weeks. We had that ugly scene outside the Opera House, which was just disgraceful. Melbourne has a very large Jewish population, and many of those people live in the seat that you hold in the Victorian Parliament. Have you seen and heard of a rise in anti-Semitism, and how worried are you about that?
I'm really worried, Steve. I've never, ever quite seen it the way that it is right now. Jewish businesses being boycotted, We've seen businesses where Google ratings have been giving Google ratings of 1 star to Jewish businesses. You've seen the kinds of things from councils getting involved in this kind of stuff. I know a number of kids at universities have had issues as well. You know, they're actually wiping their social media profiles because they don't want to experience this kind of stuff. So it is absolutely on the rise. And I think one of the big issues, Steve, is social media. I think people are responding to a lot of posts that they're seeing on social media. When today, with the Burgatory situation, there was a post that was put up calling for a group to meet at Monash University Caulfield to march down to Burgatory and to effectively take action. Now, that ended up being some kind of hoax, but the fact that it was put up there is scaring people. So there is keyboard warriors that are out and about doing this kind of stuff. There is no question that all of this is creating such nervousness amongst the community. And only a couple of days ago, we had Kristallnacht, which was the night of the broken glass. We had Holocaust survivors in Caulfield Park, and they were holding signs saying never again, and with another word, never again is now. And they're seeing a lot of, unfortunately, the issues of the Holocaust replaying itself right now. And it's horrific to think. I've even heard some people say who've lost family from the Holocaust said to me they're grateful that their mother or father isn't around to witness the kind of things that are playing out on our streets right now. It's horrific in terms of Jews being targeted for something that they've had nothing to do with. And to think this all started with a murder of 1,400 people, 240 hostages that have been taken, many from 14 different countries, not just Israelis, but 14 different countries. And yet, Jews are responsible for all of this. I can't believe how things have turned, largely from the left and coupled with a number of extremists on the right. But this is not the world that we want to be living in. And I would just call for calm. And I know last night we had a Liberal Friends of Israel event. We had a number of people turn out to that to provide their support for the Jewish community and their love to the Jewish community. And I want to thank them and thank so many people that have been reaching out to us right now, because I tell you, it is very hard right now to be a Jew. It is really, really hard, and I've never seen it so bad.
I feel for you and your community. It's always good to catch up with you, David Southwick. Let's hope the temperature goes down on that situation that is unfolding in Caulfield. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Steve.
Incredible to think what David Southwick just said there. Never seen it as bad. Coming up, the panel will be with me. Hamas's top leaders, we're told, terrorists they fund, are some of the richest people in the Middle East. And these people use women and children as human shields. Our panel is up next. Welcome back. Rita Panahi coming up after me, and we'll keep an eye on that situation in Caulfield. If anything develops, I'm sure Sky News will have that for you. I want to, circling with that, turn our attention to Gaza. Israel continues today its ground offensive to try and root out those Hamas terrorists still holding hostages, and we know that includes women and children. Well, there's new reports out of the US that have revealed, and we've had this hinted at before, but I think this is very interesting information, that the people of Gaza, obviously many of them live in poverty, many being treated as human shields. Well, the leaders of Hamas itself live billionaire lifestyles in places like Qatar. Now, the terror group's 3 top leaders, can you believe this figure, are worth a total of $17 billion, with a B, not million, dollars, and they live a life of luxury, as I said, in Qatar. It's shocking stuff. Joining me to discuss is our power panel for the night, Sky News contributors Tina McQueen and Prue McSween. Tina, Prue, welcome to the show. Always great to see you both. Let's start with you, Prue. I mean, the Qataris hosting these terrorists in their country is bad enough, but how can Hamas pretend to be on the right side of history when their leadership are living like the life of billionaires?
Well, they can't, Steve. You know, they've been funneling money, and what's worrying me is a lot of it is foreign aid money, and no one's bothering to scrutinise where it's going. We know that they've got the Palestinian people cast in servitude. They're milking the money away from what they should be getting for their infrastructure. It's an appalling situation.
Tina, we were just speaking there with the Deputy Liberal leader in Victoria, David Southwick. I thought his comments at the end of that chat with me were quite disturbing. He said he has never seen ever the level of anti-Semitism that he's currently witnessing. He holds the seat of Caulfield with a large Jewish population. Why do you think Hamas has so much support among Australians? It doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Well, it's the same in Sydney, Steve, and there's these huge rallies with they're pro-Palestinian, but I tell you what they don't do, they don't condemn Hamas. So if you don't condemn them, you're with them. And it's really frightening. There's another big rally tomorrow. Every weekend there's these rallies in Sydney. And I go to a hairdresser in suburbs in Sydney, and the women there, the Jewish women, cry constantly. They're so scared, Steve, it's horrible.
Well, Tina, you know, we've seen these protests right around the country. We've even got a left-green, surprise, surprise, council, Marybeck Council in Victoria, that had a council meeting the other night, and they passed a motion that they were going to fly the Palestinian flag for the next 6 months.
Yeah, that's just disgraceful. It's incredibly cruel to do that to the Jewish population and to most recent decent-minded Australians. Steve, they should stick to what councils do best and not bother with that.
I don't think councils do much best when you think about it. Prue, the PM, he's out of the country still. He's at the Pacific Forum on the island of Tuvalu. He's announced that he's going to allow Tuvalu people to apply for a new visa to move to Australia. Now, obviously, you know, we need immigration, maybe not at the level it's currently sitting at, but doesn't this set up a precedent? I mean, what's to stop another Pacific nation saying, well, hang on, if you're going to do that for Tuvalu, you need to do it for me in the Solomon Islands or the Cook Islands? And this all seems to be a sop to the Pacific Island nations to try and keep China out. This is setting a dangerous precedent, I think.
Well, it is, but of course he's either growing the public service or he's using immigration to get more voters for the Labor Party. These Tuvalu workers and any others from the South Pacific might be the better ones to import, because at least they're going to do the jobs that all the people on the dole, the people we pay not to work, who want to sit on their couch all day watching television or at the beach, you know, they will do the jobs that we need being done. So I can see it's a concerning precedent, but at least I think these people will work.
Tina, I think, like me, you get sick and tired of international actors and celebrities lecturing us all about how we should live our lives better. The latest one, Kate Blanchett, she's complained in a UN speech about, quote, the devastating physical and mental torment that refugees experienced in detention centres. I mean, seriously, that's at the UN trashing her own country.
Oh, look, she's a waste of space, you know, and these high-profile actors with the big mouths, they never take any in themselves. Look, we did everything right by immigration. It's now being buggered up by the Labor government, but she needs a long, hard look at herself and a decent reality check. She's a disgrace, and we're all tired of her opening her mouth, slagging our country, Steve. Go away, Kate.
Prue, I guess you agree?
Oh, 100%. You know, she's off making movies and things. She wouldn't know what was going in here. She lives in this castle and wouldn't know what the real people are thinking and enduring. So, you know, bugger off, Kate. Don't come back. When she went to that 2020 vision thing that Rudd had when he first came in, she was a pretender then,
That's
you
right.
know. Oh, I mean, it was just a joke.
Oh,
so.
Thanks.
Then he went and saw a baby, remember?
Thanks for the memory of that. Thanks for the memory of that. All I need is that picture of Kevin Rudd sitting on the floor drawing on butcher's paper. Tina, thank you, Prue. Thank you, Tina. Rita Panahy's up next.